Welcome. I'm Dr. Frank Connor, Chair of the Psychology Department. Thank you for coming to the last of our 4 Psychology Department speaker series for this academic year. It is my pleasure today to introduce to you Dr. Bryan Gibson. Dr. Gibson is a professor of psychology and is Director of Experimental Programs at Central Michigan University. Dr. Gibson did his undergraduate work at the University of Washington, and his graduate work, his PhD, is from the University of Utah. Please welcome Dr. Gibson.
Thank you, Dr. Connor, and thanks to the Psychology Department at Grand Rapids Community College for having me here today. I really enjoy the research and the work that I do, and so it's always a pleasure to get up and share some of the things that I do with others. And so I'm going to talk to you today a little bit about media effects. And the title there, Can Watching TV or Playing Video Games Really Change the Way You Think and What You Do? It's posed as a question because often if I'm talking to somebody and they hear about the kinds of research on media that I do, there's usually a little skepticism about whether or not media can actually do anything significant to their psychological experience or their behavior. And so I'm going to start out by addressing that question. And I'm going to use the remainder of my time in giving the talk to try to convince you that it really does affect you. But first I want to kind of address the questions of why it is that we're resistant to believing that media can affect us in important ways. And by the way, I forgot to mention, if you have any questions or comments anytime, please feel free to interrupt. There also should be time for conversation at the end. So one of the reasons that we might be resistant to this idea that media can affect us is that each and every one of us wants to be the author of our own life. We want to feel as if we are making reasoned choices, making decisions based on our own personal preferences, and the idea that somehow watching a movie or playing a video game can have some kind of effect on us that maybe we don't intend is a little bit uncomfortable. And so this desire to want to maintain the belief that we are sort of the executive in control of our actions makes it a difficult thing to consider that maybe these media experiences that we all have could affect us in some way. So that's one thing that we have to overcome. Now, as that bullet point notes, it's much easier for us to agree that, well, media can affect other people, right? This is called the third person effect. So we tend to be more willing to accept the idea that, well, perhaps other people are shaped and molded by their media experiences, but not me. I would like you to maybe step back and reevaluate that and consider the possibility that you might be affected by media. Another factor is that admitting that media can affect us, particularly in negative ways, could create an experience of cognitive dissonance. So cognitive dissonance is the idea that we all like to maintain internal consistency, and one of the things that we like to believe is that we're good people, and therefore it's difficult, for example, if you happen to be a gamer and you like to play video games that sometimes might be violent, it's hard to believe that these games can affect me in this negative way. On the one hand, I want to believe I'm a good person, I'm kind. On the other hand, I play these games, and accepting the fact that this game might be able to influence me and in some negative way is a difficult thing to accept. And so one way that we can deal with that cognitive dissonance is to just reject the idea that this is really affecting us. So that would be another hurdle to overcome to try to adopt this belief that media can be powerful and could affect us. Other reasons that could be related to that cognitive dissonance one is that oftentimes people who are resistant to this idea that media can be a powerful effector of your actions is that when they don't want to believe it, they set up what are called straw man arguments. In other words, arguments that really are easy to knock down, but in reality are not exactly what the people who are saying media has an effect are trying to convince you of. Let me give you just a couple of examples of those. So a common one is, well, I've played a lot of violent video games or watched a lot of violent movies, and I've never killed anybody. And of course, they're probably telling you the truth, probably. And the problem is that there is no media researcher around who is going to make the argument that everybody who plays a violent video game is going to go out and kill somebody. That is not something that any kind of media researcher would endorse as a likely scenario, and therefore it's easy to knock down that argument because nobody's trying to make that argument. And so again, if you're motivated not to believe that media can affect you in this way, then you might start setting up these straw men to knock over. Another one that is commonly heard is people have been aggressive or violent forever, way before media around, so clearly media isn't causing this. Another problem with this is that, again, it's a straw man argument. No media psychologist is going to try to convince you that the only reason people might be violent or aggressive is because they watch violent media. That is not at all what the case I'm going to make is going to try and propose to you. Aggression and violence are very complex human behaviors, and they are very likely multiply determined. In other words, there are many, many, many factors that will go into, for example, people determining that they're going to be aggressive or violent or not. And so again, it's easy to throw that argument out there, but it's not an argument that anybody's really trying to make. So another example of a reason that people may be resistant to the idea that media can affect them is that the creators of the media often will deny that there are any kinds of effects of the products that they create. So Quentin Tarantino, who's creating these very violent movies, is quoted as saying, somebody else's violence is somebody else's action. To me, it's just cinema. And it's his way of saying, look, that's these people in this movie, my viewers and fans, there are other people responsible for their own actions. And that's a final point that I wanted to make before I move into some of the research on media effects, is that in no way, shape, or form, again, would anybody say media is causing some action. So we're going to talk a little bit about the kinds of questions that we can answer and the kinds of questions that we can't answer. The first sort of block in my wall of creating this idea in you that media might have an effect is to look at advertising. So this is a very specific kind of media. And advertisers pay lots and lots of money to expose you to their media creations. And so Super Bowl ads now run upwards of $4 million for 30 seconds. And I would simply pose to you this question: do you think that companies would really spend that much money if they didn't know for certain that their media is going to affect the viewer of that media? Now, it's not going to affect everybody the same way. Everybody who watches that ad is not going to go out and buy that product. However, it creates enough of a change in the viewer's evaluation of their product that they will see a change in the success of their sales. And so that kind of success in advertising is one small piece of evidence that certainly media can affect you. Here's some other examples from advertising. So you're probably familiar with the Absolut Vodka bottle campaign. So they simply created these images that sort of mirrored the look of their bottle. Those are 3 examples. When they began this ad campaign, Absolut Vodka had 2.5% of the US vodka market. By the time they stopped this campaign 25 years later, they had 50% of the US market. And this is their primary form of advertising during that time span. So again, here's an example of how this particular media campaign changed behavior, right? It made people buy that product. And so that's a very powerful kind of effect, from 2.5% of sales of vodka in the United States to 50% at the end of that period. And so again, it wasn't all at once, it wasn't everybody, but it was powerful enough to create major shifts in the ways that people purchased that product. Here's another one. Clairol hair color was famous for these does she or doesn't she commercials and print ads. And the basic idea is, this was started in 1957. The basic idea was, well, women are sort of self-conscious about coloring their hair. They don't want people to know that they might color their hair. So how can we convince them to do this? Well, if we can convince them that nobody's going to know, then they would be more open to buying that product and trying it out. Now, when they started this campaign in 1957, the data suggested that 1 out of every 11 women used hair coloring. By the time they ended this, about 5 or 6 years later, 1 out of every 2 women was coloring their hair, mostly with Clairol products. And so again, a very big change in somebody's action. And of course, there's some psychological underpinnings to that behavior too. I mean, if we want to measure attitudes, how people evaluate a particular product or class of product, those underlying psychological attitudes are likely to change as a result of these advertising campaigns as well. And there's certainly data to back that statement up as well. Now, of course, not every advertising campaign works. So back in the 80s, Coke had this brainstorm. Pepsi was digging into their market because Pepsi were doing these blind taste tests in malls and other places. It was called the Pepsi Challenge. And people, on average, when they didn't know whether it was Coke or Pepsi, they would choose Pepsi as tasting better. And so that advertising campaign was working for Pepsi. Coke said, what can we do? Well, we're going to change the formula for our product, Coke, and we're going to make it actually taste better to win those kinds of Pepsi Challenge things. And so that's going to be great for us. We're going to sell a lot more of our product if we do this. So they had a big rollout. They changed the formula to Coke, and their consumers went nuts. There were all kinds of angry letters and phone calls to Coca-Cola. And eventually, they sort of backtracked and they brought out their old formula, called it Classic Coke now, to contrast it with this new Coke. And eventually, Classic Coke came back up to where it was in terms of how much it was selling, and new Coke faded away. So advertising is not just panacea. It's not going to create positive feelings toward your product no matter what, but it does have a major impact on how we evaluate and think about products, and it has a major impact on our behavior as well, in the form of buying or not buying that product. So I think we're all probably pretty open to the idea that this form of media, being exposed to advertisements, is something that is going to affect us. And again, we might fall prey to that third person effect, thinking maybe it's not going to affect me so much, but probably it'll affect other people. Certainly, it's easy to agree with that. But now I want to get into some other aspects of media that may be a little bit more subtle and in some cases more unintentional. First, let's touch on one that's subtle but intentional. And that's another form of advertisement, which is product placement. I'm sure you've all heard of the term product placement. The idea is very straightforward. If you're watching a TV show or a movie and you see one of the characters using a particular brand of product, they don't need to say anything about it. They don't need to formally endorse it. But just seeing them use the product, the companies tend to think, this is something that's going to benefit us. It will make our product sell more units, and that's a good thing. Now, this only got research attention within the last 10 to 15 years, but it's been around for a long time. The very first Oscar-winning film in 1927 is a silent film called Wings, and Clara Bow used or ate a Hershey bar, and the Hershey's label was prominently displayed on that. And so, again, it's from very early on, and I'm sure you're familiar with other examples. E.T., Spielberg classic, in order to draw out the alien, Elliot uses these Reese's Pieces to try and draw them out. And an interesting story behind this is that by this time, the production companies were selling rights to companies to place their brands within the film. And so they first approached Mars Corporation, which is the parent company for M&M's. And they said, we've got this scene in this movie, and we want to use your product, M&M's, prominently in this movie. And they're asking about $1 million for the rights to have them use that product within the movie. Mars turned them down. So they went to the parent company of Reese's Pieces. They knew very little about the movie. They just knew it was a Steven Spielberg production. It was about an alien visiting Earth. But they said, we're going to just jump in, and they paid the production company $1 million to have their product placed in the movie. And the result was that the sales of Reese's Pieces jumped 70% in 1 month following the release of the movie. And so there's some sort of anecdotal evidence that product placement is a strategy that can be very effective. And again, a powerful driver of behavior. People are going out, seeking out this product and buying it when they see it used in the movie. Recently, some of my graduate students and co-authors and myself have been looking into how product placement might work and how effective it might be. So I'm going to talk about a couple of studies that I've been involved with that tried to evaluate this question. So in this first study, we wanted to ask, does seeing a popular character using a brand influence both brand attitude, in other words, your evaluation of the brand? So if I ask you, how do you feel about this brand on a scale of 1 to 7, what's your response, that kind of measure. But we also were interested in self-identification. Before I get to more details about the movie, we used Friends as the TV show that we're evaluating. And we wanted to identify instances in which product placement was more subtle and another where it was more overt. So in the subtle product placement episode, Joey was wearing this sweatshirt that had the Nike logo on the sweatshirt for most of the episode. And so again, very subtle. There's no specific mention that he's wearing Nike at all. And so 1/3 of our sample was randomly assigned to watch that episode in my lab. I've got a nice lab set up. I've got a TV in there and a PlayStation, and I can do all kinds of stuff in there to show people media to see how it affects them. 1/3 of the sample was shown a different episode in which Monica gives her nephew these little Nike sneakers. And so there's a visual component to that product placement. But in addition, after Monica opens these up and gives them to Ben, Phoebe comes over and grabs the sneakers and says, "Just do it." So that's their catchphrase, right? That's the Nike catchphrase. And so now we've got not only the visual placement, but there's a verbal mention of the product's catchphrase. And then 1/3 of the sample saw a control episode in which they saw an episode of Friends in which there was no visual or verbal discussion of Nike. Now, after they saw these episodes, or one of these episodes, we then took some measures about what they thought about Nike. First, we did brand recall, though. We asked them, do you remember seeing any products or brands within the episode that you watched? Now, there were 25 people in each condition. And so we were curious to see how many people could sort of pull back from their memory seeing a brand in there. We also asked them to rate Nike as a brand. Now, one of the things that we might be concerned with is that we don't want them to kind of figure out what we're really dealing with, because that might lead them to respond in ways they think we want them to respond. And so we included ratings of a bunch of other products as well. So Nike was just kind of included among those just as another brand that we were asking about. We also took a measure of implicit brand attitudes using what's called the Implicit Association Test, the IAT. How many of you have heard of the IAT? Okay. It's a very popular way to measure something that's based on a relatively recent idea in social psychology. From the very beginning of the field of social psychology, way back in the 1930s, social psychologists were interested in attitudes. We felt it's important to understand how people evaluate things, other people, brands, ideas like gun control or abortion rights or any kind of ideas. You can have attitudes about those things, and that's basically your evaluation of that. From the very beginning of the field, we tried to assess your attitude by just asking you about it. So I would say, how do you feel about X? And then you'd have a scale from low, not I'm very against it, or I have a negative attitude about it, to high, to in the middle. So you could rate it on the scale. But in the 1990s, research on what's called implicit social cognition began to emerge. And these researchers suggested that all of our evaluations aren't necessarily conscious. We might have feelings or attitudes about things that we're not completely aware of. And these kinds of attitudes might be built up simply through associations that we observe in our day-to-day interactions. So you might see, this thing that's always with something good, and it leads you to just have a positive feeling about it. So the question would be, if this idea is correct, and we have these implicit attitudes, we need to figure out how to measure them, because if we're right, I can't just ask you what it is, because you may not know, right? You may not have access to that information. So researchers at Harvard and other places came up with what's called the implicit association test. And one of the initial implicit association tests that they created was designed to measure implicit racial attitudes. And so let me just go over the logic of this. I'm going to return to the racial IAT a little bit later as it relates to some media things. But basically, imagine that you're sitting at the computer and you have a blank screen in front of you except for these word categories up at the top left and top right of the screen. And what happens is you see these little pictures that pop up on the screen, and your job is to, as quickly as you can, if the person is African American, in this case you would hit the I key on the right side of the keyboard. And if the person was a Caucasian American, you would hit the E key over on the left side of the keyboard. So that corresponds to the left and right labels at the top of the screen. But sometimes, in addition to these little pictures of faces, there are also words. So the words can be good or bad. So love would be a good word, and in this particular scenario, if love came up, you would hit the E key for, it's on the left side of the screen. If hate comes up, you would hit the I key over on the right side of the screen. And so you're told to just go as fast as possible, and the computer, while you're doing this, is measuring how quickly you respond in milliseconds. So it's down to the thousandth of a second how quickly you can respond. So you do this for a while, but then they do something different. They switch at one of the categories. So you might have started out with European American and good on the left and African American or bad on the right, but then they'll switch the word categories. So it will now be European American and bad and African American and good. And you get some time to practice that, but then you're again told to make these judgments, go as quickly as possible. Anybody start to see what the logic is going to be here? The idea is, if you have some sort of unconscious negative evaluation of African Americans, then you will be going much slower when African American faces are paired with good words. It'll be harder to sort of make your mind reconcile those things, and it'll slow you down. On the other hand, if you have these unconscious negative biases against African Americans, and African Americans are paired on the same side as bad words, that should be easy for you because it fits what your particular implicit bias might be. And so the way the implicit association test works is it just times you. And it looks at the average response time when it's paired in this way and compares it to the average response time when it's paired in the other way. And the bigger the discrepancy, then the more bias is indicated by that test. Now, what does this have to do with brands? Well, one of the nice things about this implicit association test is that you can adjust it to measure for other concepts. So for example, what we did was we had, instead of African American or European American, we had Nike or Reebok. And then instead of pictures, we had the logos of Nike or Reebok that would show up. And again, we used good and bad words and flipped it just like in the other one that I talked about. And so that would allow us to measure implicit or unconscious attitudes toward the Nike brand. Finally, we also measured implicit brand self-identification. And the idea here is similar to the implicit association test, but instead of measuring whether you sort of unconsciously think Nike is good or bad, what we're trying to assess is whether you unconsciously connect that brand to yourself. How would we do this? Well, instead of having good or bad words, we have words related to the self and words related to other people. So good words might be love, happy, stuff like that. Self words would be I, me, mine, and other words, them, they, theirs. And so again, the logic is similar. If I'm faster when Nike is paired with self-related words, then that means that I have more of an implicit self-identification with that brand. It's sort of more integrated into me. And I think one way to think about this is that sometimes people get very invested in the kinds of brands that they use, right? And so we do tie up our sense of self in some of the products that we identify with. So what did we find? The brand recall was more when you had the visual and verbal. So when Phoebe went over and said, just do it, while holding those little Nike sneakers. But still, only 7 out of 25 people remembered that Nike was part of that. And so brand recall was very bad. When it was just Nike on Joey's sweatshirt, no mention was made of the brand. Only 2 people out of 25 remembered that Nike was in there. Now, when you see that, you might think, wow, the product placement failed, right? I mean, if they're not remembering that the brand is in there, then it's probably not having any effect. But that's not what we found. We did find no effects for the explicit and implicit brand attitudes. In other words, their positive or negative evaluation of the brand. But the people who had Nike show up in their episodes that they watched had a stronger implicit connection to the brand, even if they didn't remember seeing it. That was the surprising part to us. You did not have to remember that Nike was in that show, but if it was, you felt a stronger connection to the brand after watching that episode. So this is something that people start to feel a little less comfortable about, right? I mean, at least with a commercial on TV, an advertisement, you know that this company is trying to change your attitude and your behavior. It's an overt attempt to shape what you think and how you act. But this is a lot more difficult to deal with. People feel like, well, if it's an advertisement, if it's a commercial, they're trying to change my attitude, but I know what they're doing and I can defend myself if I want to. I can say, I don't want to listen to your advertisement. I'm not going to do what you want me to do. That allows us to feel in control. However, people start feeling a lot more uncomfortable when they realize that just seeing a brand and not even remembering that it's there can subtly shift the way that they feel about that brand and how it might be connected to who they think they are. So now we're starting to get into these media effects that seem a little bit more nefarious, right? They're kind of working under the surface and maybe affecting us in ways that we're not aware of, and yet could be a powerful influence on the kinds of decisions we make. Let me talk quickly about some other research that my lab looked at. In this one, we wanted to test out the idea that part of the way that product placement works is that some of the positive feelings you have about the movie or TV show that you're watching may sort of rub off on the brand that's in the movie. But that raises the question, what if you're watching something that you don't really like? And so what we did here is we pre-tested a sample of students in a questionnaire that had a bunch of other stuff in it. We asked them how much they liked sci-fi movies. And after we got that information, we recruited people who loved sci-fi movies, and we recruited people who hated sci-fi movies. And then they saw a clip from the movie Blade Runner, not the more recent sort of follow-up, but the original Blade Runner. And in that movie, there's a prominent placement for Coca-Cola. So this Coca-Cola billboard is in the city, and they're sort of flying past it in their vehicles a couple times. And the question is, well, how does that affect their attitude about Coke? It turns out it depends on whether they like sci-fi or not. If they like sci-fi, their attitudes toward Coke were more positive. If they didn't like sci-fi, their attitudes about Coke were more negative. And so that feeling that you got from the movie, I like this, or this is boring, I hate it, sort of transferred over to the product. So there's another thing for companies to consider, right? If you're placing your brand within a TV show or a movie, you better hope that it's a generally popular TV show or movie, because if it's not, you actually might be shooting yourself in the foot. So to kind of summarize this, product placement can have potentially either positive or negative effects on your brand attitudes, and it can work outside of your awareness. You don't even have to know that this is happening for it to have a subtle effect on how you're evaluating those brands. So that kind of wraps up what I wanted to say about advertising and the different ways that advertisers might try to shape your psychological evaluations of their product and your behavior toward that product. Now I'm going to move into some other aspects of how media might affect us that can be a little bit more controversial. So violent media is something that's been researched for well over 60 years. Social psychologists have been asking questions about how exposure to violent media might affect us. And so one of the main questions that has been asked is, can watching violent movies or TV or playing violent video games lead to increases in aggression? Now, when we ask this question, one of the clear goals that we might have is to help us try to understand violence in society. I mean, our country is facing a problem with gun violence, right? We have more mass shootings by orders of magnitude more than any other country in the world. And when these things happen, we want to know why, right? A tragedy happens, we have a basic human need to explain it, to understand it. And so when we see violence and aggression, we want to try to understand where it comes from. And, well, it's within the realm of possibility, at least worthy of consideration, that violent media could play a role in this. But I wanted to talk a little bit, well, here's actually, before I talk about something else, this is a clip from The Simpsons just to show you how prevalent this idea has seeped into the popular culture. So Marge makes a discovery in this clip. So Marge has discovered that Maggie is being shaped by these cartoons that she's watching. And of course, this is the basic premise for much of the research on violent media. It's sort of, if you see these violent actions, will you then do violent things as a result? So one way that this could happen would be to focus on kids and how, like, violent cartoons like Itchy and Scratchy or real cartoons that are violent might affect little kids. And again, this is something that adults might find easy to buy into. The fact that if you've got this sort of young human being who's being shaped by a variety of sources, if you show them violent stuff, it could shape what they think is right and wrong. That's kind of an easy thing to believe. But what about for us? What about for grown-ups? We're watching stuff that's a lot worse than Itchy and Scratchy, right? Here's a clip from Kill Bill, and I want to warn you, if you don't like blood and you get kind of creeped out with gore, close your eyes, because this is a bloody clip. And I want to ask a question after we're done with this clip. So here it is. Come on. Uh-oh, technical difficulties. We checked out the Simpsons clip before I started, but we didn't check this one out. All right. Well, I'm sure that many of you have seen Kill Bill, but in this clip, basically, the heroine chops off the arm of this woman who's bleeding all over as the scene continues, and then there are other kind of guys with samurai swords coming down to attack that woman, and she's taking care of all of them, basically, killing all of these people in this scene. And that's just one scene in this movie in which there are plenty of scenes similar to this. So what are we doing to ourselves by exposing ourselves to this kind of violence? Now, on the one hand, you have people throwing up the straw man argument, right? Well, was there an epidemic of samurai sword killings after Kill Bill came out? No, there weren't. So obviously it's not having an effect, right? But that is making some assumptions that aren't necessarily valid. One assumption in that is that the only way violent media can affect you is to lead you to do exactly what you see in the media. But that's not really what researchers on violent media would suggest. There are other ways that violent media might affect your psychological experience, how you process information, and therefore then what kinds of behaviors you're likely to enact after seeing the violent media. So for example, an alternative path that's been studied in research for a long time is that if you watch violent media it brings to the top of the cognitive bin, in other words, it makes more accessible in your thinking, aggressive responses. So in other words, if you watch violent media and then you're at a bar and somebody insults you, well, because you have aggressive violent actions available in memory, aggressive violent actions become more likely to be set on as a response to the insult that you've just received at the bar. So again, these psychological pathways are not just see it, do it. It's like see it, how does that change the way you think? How does that change the way you look at people around you? And then how does that change the kinds of behaviors you select from when you try to determine what your best action should be in that scenario? So, does watching violent movies or TV or playing violent video games lead to more aggression? And again, I'm going to go back to this idea of what kinds of questions we can answer and what kinds of questions we can't answer. Many times we start to read in news stories about violent media effects after things like school shootings. And again, it comes from our desire to try and explain things and understand things, to figure out why things happened. One of the early school shootings was in Columbine, Colorado, in 1999. And after this event, at the time it was the largest school shooting in history, people wanted to know why. Why did these kids turn on their classmates and gun them down? And it turns out that when you look at what these two guys did in their spare time, is they played a lot of Doom, which was a violent video game popular at the time. And so it led many people to say, ah, we have the culprit, right? Violent video games caused these kids to go shoot their classmates because they're just doing what they were doing in the video game. They're shooting monsters in the video game, but now they're trying to enact that in real life. What I would like to propose to you is that that's sort of a faulty reasoning, right? And the problem is that for any one event out in the real world, we have no way of determining the exact cause of that event. And in fact, there are probably multiple factors that work together to contribute to the execution of that event. Another thing that people like to say when you have school shootings is, well, the kid was obviously mentally disturbed, right? There was a mental health problem that led to this event. And it's hard to argue that. My colleague at Ohio State, Brad Bushman, likes to say, however, school shootings are often not the result of mental health issues, but anger issues, right? And kids are going to be very angry, and without that anger, they're going to be unlikely to engage in these kinds of actions. But again, it's impossible to say what would have happened with these two kids if they'd never played Doom or had any other violent video game. We don't know, and we can't know. And so when we talk about any specific event out in the world, don't look to psychological research to explain exactly why that happened. What you can do is to look to psychological research and say, well, what they seem to have found is that X, Y, and Z contribute to violence, and any of those factors may have been at work in this, but we cannot say for certain. So, what can we say for certain? Well, researchers who look at questions of violent media and try and understand how they affect aggression and other kinds of outcomes have a particular way of looking at the world that is designed to allow us to assess cause and effect within a laboratory setting. But here's some examples of the kinds of things that players might experience within a game. In case you haven't played violent games, this one's just kind of a screen capture of one particular game called The Getaway, and it shows you a little bit about how you might experience the world when you're playing this game, I hope. And again, it's not giving me that clip. Well, basically, the guy wanders through this warehouse area and shoots up a bunch of people. And of course gets shot too, but the great thing about video games is all he has to do is lean against the wall for a few seconds and then he regains health so he can go on. One thing that a doctor talking about media violence said was she was treating a gunshot victim in the ER. And he kept saying how surprised it was how much it hurt to get shot. And, you know, that sounds silly, but you might understand it better if you say, well, maybe that person was playing these games all the time and getting shot in the game and not feeling that pain. And so those connections aren't necessarily made. So, does playing violent video games lead to more aggression? I'm not going to talk about any specific studies, but I'm going to talk about sort of a general model of how researchers in this area go about trying to answer this question. So, typically, the researcher would randomly assign participants to play either a violent or a non-violent game. Often, they give them 20 minutes to a half hour to play these games. In many cases, they don't have instructions. They just are given the game and told to play. So a non-violent game might be a racing game, Gran Turismo, something like that. A violent game could be Mortal Kombat, or it could be Grand Theft Auto, any kind of game that has that potential for a lot of violence in it. Following playing the games, they then measure aggression. And this is done in a variety of different ways. A couple of the more popular ways to measure aggression is to convince people that after they play the game, that they're competing on a reaction time task with a subject in another room who's also on a computer, and they're going to look at the screen, and when a light goes from red to green, they hit the space bar, and they're told, if you're faster than your opponent, he will be blasted with white noise. It's this really unpleasant, they're wearing headphones, it's a really unpleasant kind of mix of noises. And before they have that little competition on reaction time, you get to set how loud it's going to be if you win and how long that blast is going to last. And so that is the measure of aggression. The idea is if I'm setting it, I want to blast you for a long time with a super loud noise, that's more aggressive. If I just blast you for half a second with this sort of soft little noise, that's very unaggressive. Another more recent way to try and operationalize aggression is you're told after playing the game, now we're into another study, and it's a study on taste preferences. You're going to either be the restaurateur or you're going to be the taster, and they're always set up to be the restaurateur, and they get a food preference thing from some other participant, and the participant says, I hate hot sauce. It's too hot, it burns my mouth. And then they're told, well, the stuff that they're going to taste is hot sauce, so you get to decide how much to give them. And so they weigh how many grams of hot sauce this person gives to this other person who hates hot sauce. So that's the measure of aggression. Now, here's one of the problems with research on media violence and how it affects aggression. Critics of these measures will often say, well, I can see how you could call that aggression, but it's not really similar to what we're talking about out in life, right? It's not punching somebody in the face. It's not shooting somebody with a gun or stabbing somebody with a knife. But of course, those research projects don't get by the internal review board. We can't do those. So, you know, we're not going to do a study where people are going to punch somebody else. But that's kind of the best that we can do in the laboratory to try and tap in to how aggression might change as a result of playing these violent games. We also can sometimes measure violent emotions like anger. So we might have people playing the games, and then a research confederate insults them, and then we measure how angry they are as a result of that. We measure aggressive thoughts that they might have about hurting others, things like that. And also some studies have looked at helping behavior, how much we're willing to go out of our way to help somebody else after we play a game that is either violent or not. The results tend to show that, and this has been replicated many, many times in many different ways, playing violent games increases aggression, it increases aggressive emotions, and it increases aggressive thoughts. It also tends to reduce helping behavior. We also have measured things like empathy, how much you sort of put yourself in somebody else's position or shoes. And playing violent games tends to reduce the amount that people will do that. So in general, the research on violent video games seems to suggest that there's some potentially negative consequences. Aggression goes up, anger goes up, helping goes down. Similar effects are found in research on violent movies and TV shows. So instead of playing a violent video game, you might have somebody watch a movie that's violent or not, and then engage in the same kind of measures. But aggression is not just intending to physically harm somebody else. Researchers have also become interested in what they call relational aggression, which is an attempt to harm somebody either emotionally or with the relationships that they have. So for example, starting a nasty rumor about somebody else would be a form of relational aggression. Gossiping about somebody behind their back would be a relational aggression action. Insulting somebody to their face, trying to intentionally embarrass somebody. These are all what would fall into the category of relational aggression. Now, there's been very little research done on how media depictions of relational aggression might affect viewers. And so recently some of my colleagues and I have looked at shows that include a lot of relational aggression. So we looked at how watching Jersey Shore or other similar kinds of shows might affect the psychological experience of viewers. If you haven't watched Jersey Shore, it is a show that is rife with all kinds of relational aggression. They're just kind of nasty to each other, and they gossip about other people, and they say nasty things, and so there's a whole ton of that in there. And what we were interested in figuring out is whether that might prompt people to be more physically aggressive after having seen that relational aggression in the TV show. So they watched an episode that was from one of 4 different genres. So the relationally aggressive reality TV, violent TV, and this was really violent stuff. It was from Dexter. If you haven't seen Dexter, he's a serial killer, and it gets pretty graphic. There was a positive reality TV, which was Little People, Big World. So a family of little people who are trying to come to grips with living in a world built for people bigger than them. But there's not a lot of negative stuff in that show, or a comedy show. Following watching one of these genres of show, we measured aggression. We used that paradigm where they had a chance to blast somebody else with white noise. And those who had watched that sort of relationally aggressive reality TV were most aggressive. And surprisingly to us, they were even more aggressive than the people who watched Dexter. And it wasn't a significant difference, but it was a little bit more. And so what we concluded is that if you are exposed to relational aggression with media, then that also brings to mind sort of treating people poorly, and that can lead to greater chances of becoming aggressive after watching such a show. Now, violence is not the only quality of media. The media we expose ourselves to can vary across a wide range of dimensions. And one question that seemed to be of importance in our current culture is this question of narcissism. We wanted to know if seeing narcissistic characters increased viewer narcissism. And the reason that this might be important is that some research that looks at sort of how college students respond to this questionnaire called the Narcissistic Personality Inventory was developed in the early 80s. And so we have college samples who completed the Narcissistic Personality Inventory from the early 80s all the way through the 90s and 2000s up until today. And by the way, just as an aside, if you're not familiar with the term, narcissism simply means being overly convinced of your own value and worth. So these individuals who are narcissistic have inflated views of the self, and they also tend to be very defensive about that view of themselves. They are not willing to consider criticisms. They aren't likely to consider change. And so what this research has found is that over time, from the 1980s until today, the level of narcissism has been increasing steadily in the United States. So somebody, a college student today who completes the Narcissistic Personality Inventory, basically, if you look at the distribution of scores, the students today who score average on the Narcissistic Personality Inventory, if they were taking that inventory in the 1980s, they would be in the top 10% of people taking that test. In other words, that whole bell curve has just shifted. And today, people are far more narcissistic than they were in the past. Now, there's a variety of reasons that this might happen, but one of the things that my co-authors and I wondered is, well, there might be media available that displays these narcissistic qualities more readily, and perhaps watching these things can shift the narcissistic tendencies of the viewers. And so we randomly assigned them again to watch a narcissistic reality TV show like Jersey Shore. And again, if you haven't seen that show, the people in this show are just incredibly narcissistic. They're incredibly self-centered. They don't seem to care about other people. They preen and strut and just think they're the greatest thing since sliced bread. After seeing that show, they were more narcissistic as long as they were encouraged to try and adopt the view or identify with one of the characters. If that encouragement was not given prior to watching, it did not affect their level of narcissism. Now, that might limit the generalizability of this result, but also think about people who become fans of a show. One of the reasons they might become fans is that they start to identify with the characters in the show. They start to think like they might think, and this study suggests that that might actually shift the level of narcissism in the people viewing the show. Now, narcissism has a variety of negative consequences. So for example, people who are insulted, if they're narcissistic, they're much more likely to lash out aggressively, okay, than people who aren't narcissistic. People who are not narcissistic are more likely to sort of let it roll off their back and not do anything aggressive. People who are narcissistic have much more difficulty in relationships, right? Because think about your stereotype of what a good relationship is. There's give and take, right? People who are narcissistic have much more trouble with that kind of thing. And so if it's true that we have this narcissism epidemic, then there could be some negative consequences to that. Now I'm going to move to another effect that my colleagues and I have been looking at. And this is how race is portrayed in video games. Again, social psychologists have for a long time been interested in racism, stereotyping, and where those things come from and what their consequences are. And so we wanted to see how that variable in a video game could affect the people playing the game. We randomly assigned some of our participants to play a game called Saints Row 2. And this is very similar to Grand Theft Auto. You basically have a big city environment available, and you can go around in there. You can get guns, you can shoot people, you can do a lot of different kinds of things. But the reason we chose this game is because we could control the race of the avatar that they are playing within the game. And here's just some of the racial depictions within this game. So as I mentioned, there are a lot of stereotypical depictions and also some very gruesome violence, chainsaws, etc. And our question was, how was playing that game as a black avatar, would that affect their implicit or explicit racism and their aggression? So what we found was that playing as a black avatar led to more implicit and explicit racism. So after they played the game, they took the implicit association test that I went over before, that had the photos and the positive and negative words. And after playing as a black avatar, the player had more implicit racism to African Americans, also more explicit racism. In a follow-up study, they played Mortal Kombat as either a black avatar or a white avatar, and then they were given a chance to be aggressive following that gameplay. Those who had played as a black avatar were more aggressive than those who had played as a white avatar. Now, one of the ways to think about that last finding is that there are a variety of negative, pernicious stereotypes about African Americans that sort of invade our socio-cultural space. One is that African Americans are more aggressive. And if they're playing an African American avatar and then they get a chance to be aggressive, they start to act more in line with that pernicious stereotype. In later research, so more aggressive after playing as a black avatar. In later research, we wanted to explore other aspects of what, yeah, question?
Were the participants white?
Yes, all the participants in this study were white. We would have liked to have had African American participants, but in CMU, there just there's not a big enough sample of folks to draw upon, so we couldn't get enough people in. So in a sense, that idea of being more aggressive after playing as a black avatar falls in line with what social psychologists call a stereotype to behavior effect. And there's a wide variety of studies that show this idea. The idea is very simple. If you activate a stereotype about a particular group, people tend to start to behave like their stereotype of the group. There are a variety of examples of this. John Barge and his colleagues did a famous study published in the 90s where they activated the elderly stereotype. They had people complete a word completion task that had words like, I don't know, they were related to the elderly stereotype. Things like, well, Florida was one of them, I know, but there were other kinds of stereotype activating things. But none of the words were related to one aspect of the stereotype, which is that you slow down when you're older. And after they completed this word task, they were let go from the experiment and they timed the people on the way to the elevator to leave the study. The people who had had the stereotype of the elderly activated walked more slowly on the way to the elevator than the people in the control group who did not have the elderly stereotype activated. So again, the idea is you activate the stereotype, then people start to enact what they believe is a component of the stereotype. Another study published in the 90s activated either the professor stereotype or a soccer hooligan stereotype. Now, this study was carried out in Europe, but you probably are familiar with the idea of a soccer hooligan. They go around to soccer matches and pick fights with the opposing fans and get into brawls and stuff like that. Then they were given a trivia test. Now, what are the stereotypes of these two groups? Professors, the stereotype is smart. Soccer hooligans, the stereotype is not smart. The trivia test showed that difference. The people who had the professor stereotype activated performed better on the trivia test than the people who had the soccer hooligan stereotype activated. Now, unfortunately, stereotypes of African Americans have similar prescriptions about academic performance. And Wheeler and Petty demonstrated this. Activating the African American stereotype led people to do worse on a math test. And so what we wondered is whether that kind of activation of the stereotype through the avatar in the game might lead to similar kinds of effects. This study is currently under review, but basically, again, they played played Saints Row, either as a white avatar or a black avatar. They played Gran Turismo as the control group, so race is not part of that game. And they then took a difficult math test. It had 30 items that were drawn from sample items from the GRE, the Graduate Records Examination. Relatively difficult. They also completed the IAT. And those playing as the black avatar performed significantly worse on the math test than the other groups. So again, here's an effect of media in which if the media sort of enhances a stereotype or portrays a stereotype, it can lead to stereotypical behavior on the part of the people who are now exposed to the media. So again, another way in which media sort of subtly and maybe perniciously gets into our psychology.
Just a quick clarification back to that game that you said race wasn't a factor in that control game?
Yes.
What were they?
Gran Turismo was a racing game, so you have cars, and you don't even see the driver of the car. So implications, seeing stereotypes enacted in media can alter viewers and players' behavior to fall in line with the stereotype. Now I'm going to quickly touch on some other aspects of media. So particularly in our current political environment, I've become a politics junkie. I mean, when I get up in the morning, I have to check the Washington Post to see if the world's ended yet. You know, it just seems very crazy, all the stuff's going on in our current political environment. And so we seek out news, right? We look for news about what's going on in the country. And one reasonable question is, how does our news media influence our psychological experience and potentially voter behavior? Recent research, just published this year, or maybe actually last year, 2017, demonstrates what the authors call the Fox News effect. Now, this isn't research published by psychologists, it was published by political scientists, and they published in an economics journal. But the findings have relevance for what we're talking about here. They use some sophisticated statistical modeling techniques to try and evaluate the effect of Fox News viewership on voting behavior. They looked at the 2000, the 2004, and the 2008 presidential elections. And what they found was, frankly, quite shocking. Viewing Fox News increased viewers' likelihood of voting Republican in presidential elections, and this effect grew stronger from 2000 to 2008. So this is the percentage increase in the chance that you're going to vote Republican in each of these elections, depending upon Fox News availability in your area. So in 2000, it was about 0.5% more likely if you were watching Fox News. By the 2004 election, it was about 3.8% or 3.7%. And then by the 2008 election, if you're watching Fox News, you're about 6.5 times more likely to vote Republican than if you're not watching Fox News. And another interesting aspect of these data is that another set of researchers evaluated the sort of political leanings of Fox News, CNN, and MSNBC, the three biggest cable news networks. And what they found was that over time, the leaning of Fox News became more conservative over this period of time. So if you look here, the red line is Fox News, and as it goes higher up, it's more conservative. And also you can see CNN and MSNBC got more liberal during that same time frame. But interestingly, their analysis of voting suggests that the increasing liberalness of those networks did not affect the viewers in their voting tendencies. But the increasing conservativeness of the Fox News network tended to push their viewers to be more likely to vote Republican. Now, I don't know about you, but I think one of the most important aspects of our civic behavior is voting. And to think that where we're getting our news is very powerfully a potential influence on how we're going to vote is, I'm a little bit ambivalent about that, right? I mean, it makes me a little bit concerned, particularly because we're kind of in what some people are calling the post-truth environment. It doesn't seem to matter whether the news media is telling us the truth or not, it's still powerfully influential. Some people have gone so far as to call Fox News the propaganda wing of the Republican Party. In other words, implying that they're not always truthful in what they're telling you. They're just sort of shifting the view toward the more conservative viewpoint, no matter what the news is. And that brings me to last aspect of this that I wanted to talk about. And that is a term that's become very important in the last few years, and that's fake news. And I want to talk about it in the sense, not in the way that our president talks about it, which is basically any news that I don't like is fake news, but actually in the sense of this news reports something that is not verifiably true, right? So how does that affect what we think and how we act? First, let me go over some really good ones. These are drawn from around the 2016 presidential campaign. So WikiLeaks confirms Hillary sold weapons to ISIS. That was one of the fake news stories that got a lot of play. Bill Clinton is having sex with Megyn Kelly, another fake news story that came out in that time. Denzel Washington is now endorsing Donald Trump. Obama signs an executive order banning the national anthem at all sporting events. Also not true. Pope Francis shocks the world and endorses Trump for president. And I like this one. Yoko Ono says she had an affair with Hillary Clinton in the 70s. So, I mean, these stories are, I mean, they range from mildly outlandish to I can't imagine anybody believing this. And yet, if you're following what's been happening with Cambridge Analytica and their role in sort of targeting Facebook users to try and influence the 2016 election, Basically, they scraped a bunch of Facebook user profiles. They got data on 50 million users. And then they targeted these kinds of things to people who the data suggested might be very susceptible to buying into this. And so it hasn't been something that researchers have been able to research a lot up to this point, but is something that's on the horizon. I think that this is an area that is going to receive much more attention as we move forward. So what do we know about this form of propaganda? Data suggests that conservatives are more likely to click on fake news stories. We know that much from the data that's been gathered. We still are not sure why that is. Recent research does suggest that this did not sway the 2016 election, so there might be a lot of factors going into what Russia did or did not do, but fake news itself doesn't seem to be the particular driving force of this. But I think teaching students how to distinguish between fake and real news stories would be a good start. I think it would be important to try and ensure that our political decisions are made on factual information. And that kind of thing is something that we probably should work toward, making sure people are good at sorting it out. Now, let me just wrap up here. I'm going to try and come to a couple of concluding points. So if media can affect us negatively, is there anything that we can or should do about it? How would you, if you feel more informed after hearing me talk about this today, and you want to say, okay, I want to do something about that, what are our options? What can we do? There are some personal solutions that may be beneficial. As a parent, I think it would be important to monitor and censor the material that your children use. My son is 17. He's going to be starting college in the fall. But even though we had a PlayStation in our house from the time he was little, there are many, many games he has never played because I won't let them into the house. I'm familiar with the research. I believe the research, and I did not want him to be negatively affected by the games that he was playing in our house. Now, of course, parents are in a tough spot because kids have friends have video games, parents of other friends might not think in the same way, and so it's always going to be a battle. There's always going to be some kind of way that kids might get around it, but I think that messaging is important too. You know, that this is what's in this kind of media, and I don't think that's something that we really want you to be doing right now at this age. My wife and I, just when we have family movie nights, now sometimes we watch R-rated movies because he's 17, he can go to them anyway, but at least we're there. We can, if there's some disturbing content, we can talk to him about it. It's something we can deal with in a more mature way. As a consumer, I think it's important to try to understand whether the media you are receiving is actually true. And this goes for everybody. You've probably gathered from my discussion today that I am a liberal individual and I'm not a conservative individual. But nevertheless, I don't want to be sort of reeled in by stuff that's fake, even if it fits with what I would like to believe. So for example, before the election in 2016, there was a meme that was going around in which supposedly Donald Trump said to People magazine, if I were to run, and this was in the 90s, if I were to run, I'd run as a Republican. They're the dumbest group of voters in the country. They love anything on Fox News. I could lie and they'd still eat it up. I bet my numbers would be terrific. Now, from my perspective, that fits right in with my mindset. But I said, I went to Snopes, okay? And if you don't know Snopes, you should know Snopes. They fact check stuff. So you can find out if stuff is true. Donald Trump never said this. And so no matter how much I would have liked to have believed that Donald Trump said this, I checked it out and I tried to evaluate whether I was basing my opinions on stuff that was real or stuff that was not real. And that would be something that I would encourage anybody in our current very confusing media landscape to do, to try and evaluate the truth or falsity of the information that you might be presented with. What about other kinds of solutions? What about public solutions to some bad things that might happen as a result of media? Well, brings up the question of, are we willing to try and put legal restrictions on media? Now, there's currently some things going on that might sort of lean that way. So for example, Facebook is under a lot of heat right now for allowing the data of their users to be sort of gotten by Cambridge Analytica and used in these very political ways. There's talk that Mark Zuckerberg is going to have to testify before Congress, and that Facebook might be facing a pretty large fine for the way that they treated their users' data. So that would be a potential public solution to try and ensure that our media environment is more accurate and more designed to present accurate, truthful information. That's a potential legal solution. Currently, Alex Jones, who, if you're not familiar with Alex Jones, look him up. He is a wild conspiracy theorist, conservative, who says really crazy stuff, and he has a lot of followers who believe that it's true. For example, he said the Parkland shooting and the Sandy Hook shooting, where all the kids were killed in Connecticut, that was a fake thing. It never happened. They were all actors, and it was done by the liberal media who are trying to take away guns, okay? So he's saying these shootings aren't real. That's one of his conspiracy theories. Recently, the protest in Charlottesville, Virginia, where the white supremacist groups were clashing with the counter-protesters, and one woman died, Heather Heyer, and there was a video of the car driving into the protesters that wound up killing her. And this was given to the police, and it was posted on social media. And Alex Jones began a conspiracy theory that the guy who photographed this was a member of the deep state, and that he was actually photographed. It wasn't what they said it was, and that really nobody died. And people started harassing this poor guy who simply was there with a phone and took the video. And now he is suing Alex Jones. In addition, there was a Democratic operative who, before the election, was killed in a street crime. And Sean Hannity and others at Fox News claimed that he was the one who released the Democratic emails to WikiLeaks. And that's their theory about, it's not WikiLeaks, it's not the Russians, it's this guy Seth Rich, who was killed by, and they say maybe he was killed because Hillary Clinton and others wanted him out of the picture so he wouldn't tell, right? And this is being pushed by Fox News. Well, Seth Rich's family is now suing them and Sean Hannity. So that is a potential legal solution to facing things that simply aren't true, to try and deal with these events and make our news media a little bit more answerable to these kinds of things. What other kinds of things might happen? What about restricting some forms of media? Well, as soon as you say something like that, the first word out of people's mouth is censorship, right? We have the First Amendment to support the freedom of speech, and therefore we don't want to go down the road of censoring media. And I certainly resonate with that argument. But I also want to point out that it's not as cut and dried as just saying censorship is bad, because we agree to various forms of censorship without the blink of an eye, right? If you go home and watch network TV tonight, you are not going to see X-rated sex and nudity on that TV, right? You're also not going to see bloody, gory violence. They will edit films that have that in it to show on network TV. We accept that. We don't argue about it. There was also a case a number of years ago in which there was a video game developed in Japan, and it was awful. They, basically the plot of the game is that the main character, you, a young man, was insulted by this woman and her 2 daughters, and your goal through the game is to find them and rape them. That is the goal of this video game. It's hideous. And it was banned in the United States. And I didn't see people protesting with signs saying we need to let this game in for freedom of speech issues, right? So there are forms of censorship that we seem to be willing to accept. And I would just propose to you that I don't know the answer. I don't know how much restriction is okay and how much is not, but I think it's something worth talking about, and it's not something that we can just dismiss by saying First Amendment, end of story, right? There are things we accept as censored, and that's acceptable. And I'm just going to give you one final example to think about as we leave. And this is a true case, Happened in the 1980s or 90s, I don't remember which. But there was a young teenager who killed a classmate with a baseball bat. The kid he killed was sort of an outcast, unpopular, and the murderer said, "Hey, I'm building a fort in the woods. You want to come out with me this afternoon?" And the kid said, "Sure, okay." And when they were walking out, he said, "Well, the snow's kind of deep. You have boots on. Will you walk in front of me?" And the kid walked in front of me. He took a bat, just hammered him over the head and beat him until he was dead. And when he was caught, he said, I wanted to see what it felt like to kill somebody. Well, it turns out he had been binge watching these videos called Faces of Death. And again, a very disgusting, disturbing piece of media. These are basically films of people dead or dying. If there's somebody shot by a South American firing squad and they have it on film, it can show up here. If somebody has a big car crash and somebody's there on the scene, they can film the person dying in the crash. And this is what people are watching. So it's just death after death after death. And these aren't acted, these are real people dying. And the kid said, I watched this, I just wanted to see what it would feel like. So yeah, we have some concerns about First Amendment rights, we have some concerns about censorship, but I think if we were to ask the parents of the victim of this crime whether the First Amendment was important to protect the freedom of speech about Faces of Death, and that's a creative display, I think that they might not find that that's something that they would back up. And on that note, I'll wrap things up, and we do have a few more minutes for questions if anybody has any things they want to ask. All right, thanks again for having me here. I really enjoyed being able to talk to you.
Thank you for coming. Have a great, this is the last for this semester, so those who are going to be hanging around, look for what we're doing next year. Have a great end next 5 weeks or so, and enjoy the rest of your semester.